I'm Anthony Scaramucci, and welcome to Open Book, where I talk with some of the most interesting and brilliant minds in our world today. So joining us now on Open Book is Carole Radziwill. She is an award-winning journalist and author. She's a reality television star, and she wrote literally an amazing book, and it's a quick read. It's called What Remains, a Memoir of Fate, Friendship, and Love. It went on to become a runaway bestseller. It's 20 years old, roughly 18 or so years old, but it sells like it just came out. Carole, it's great to have you on. I read the book yesterday. So I'll just tell you, I was down in Miami. I said, okay, I got the book. My producer, Barbara and Holly, they said, read the book. I read the book, couldn't put it down, primarily because it was so raw. It was so honest, and it touched me. But I want to go right to your upbringing. You have an Italian side of the family. You have an Austrian side of your family. The Italian side is more like me. We'll talk about my wife in a second, because I think you guys have a lot in common. But we're both front stabbers, aren't we, Carole? I don't see you as a backstabber. If you didn't like somebody, you would come right at them, right? Or no?
Yeah, I've never heard of that expression, but yes, I'm gonna use that now. Yeah, no, I'm pretty straightforward, and there's not a lot of subterfuge or backstabbing. You kind of know where you stand. But it comes
to me right when I read your book. I'm like, this is so open. This is so real. I mean, the title of our podcast is Open Book, and I was like, okay, this is awesome that there's somebody here writing about life. You also obviously have read a lot of Roman philosophy or Roman mythology because you tie it into the book. I want to go into that in a second as well. But tell our audience about your upbringing.
Oh, gosh. Well, I grew up in like a very large, loud, for the most part, Italian with one side Austrian. So it was quite a mix. A family, like working, I don't know, I would describe it. So working class family. My parents both worked. My dad worked 2 jobs. My mom worked 2 jobs. They had 5 kids. So, those Italian families. And, they worked all the time to keep food on the table, to keep a roof over our head. It was always like a little bit like, I remember at that time in the 70s, the bank, if you missed a mortgage payment, the bank guys would come in suits and knock at your door. So there was a little of that, so there was always it's a little precarious, but it just, I think in a way we had a childhood that was like that one, might dream of. Like, we were completely wild. We were told, I was just telling someone, my parents said, go out and play in the woods, like leave us alone, like play in the woods, don't come home. They raised 5 really independent people, me specifically. And I just thought, even though I kind of liked where I grew up and it was a fun childhood, and I had crazy relatives and aunts and uncles, there was part of me that was just feeling like my nose pressed against the town limit sign, and I wanted to get out and see the world. But we didn't have any money, so I was like, I didn't know, like, I at one point I thought, I'll be a flight attendant because my aunt was. And I thought, if I'd be a flight attendant, I'd get paid to travel. And then something happened. We all have that aha moment, and something happened. And I realized in that second, I said, that's what I want to do. I want to be a journalist. I want to be where history is happening, and I want to witness it, experience it, record it, tell other people's stories, and then that's what I did, even though I was like a poor kid from upstate New York.
Well, from the book, you grew up in Suffern. It's a town in Rockland County, but you had relatives in Kingston, which is a little farther north, and so you did a lot of weekends and summertime up in Suffern. But your upbringing very similar to mine. But I'll tell you, who it's even more similar to is my wife Deirdre. My wife Deirdre's family, father was German. Your side was Austrian. They grew up on the west side. You used the word Yorkville. I think you said that went the way of the rotary phones. Well, Yorkville was the Upper East Side in the 80s. That's where Germantown was, where the Austrians and Germans lived. There were great German delis up there, great German restaurants. So my wife is half German, and then she's also a Laga Marcino. which is similar to at 𝗕𝗺𝗁, and they moved to Rockland County. She went to Ramapo High School.
No way.
So like your parents, they left the city seeking some suburban bliss and put the kids up in Rockland County.
My parents said all the Italians from the city were all looking at houses in Rockland County, and a lot of Italians moved up.
Well, there you go. So the same sort of vintage. My wife wants to know if you were working at the Caldor in New City. Is that the Caldor, or which Caldor were you working in?
I was working in the Caldor that's so funny, in Suffern on Route 59.
On Route 59, sure. I know exactly where that is. So
there.
For the younger people here, there were two sort of stores that were sub-Target type of stores. It was called Caldor and Bradley's. And that's where the middle-class people shop for everything, their jewelry, their furniture, their clothing. I spent many a day with my parents in Caldor buying dungarees.
Well, listen, I was customer service, so I was practically management. I was the girl at the return counter, and I made announcements on the microphone. I thought I was hot shit. I was 15 years old when I started there.
And you mentioned in the book that you had a friend that went on to, or a friend that you met through the Kennedy family, Carolyn 𝗕𝗺𝘁 Kennedy. She also worked at Caldor.
Yes, she did.
She was in the jewelry department, right?
Yes, yes. It was our big secret when we married those boys. She, marrying John, and I marrying Anthony. And it took us a long time to tell them that we had both, worked summers at Caldor, because, they were water skiing, behind the Christina, in their summers in Greece. And we were wearing schmucks with says, "Hello, my name is Carol." And we got up our courage weirdly to say that's what our background was, or that's what we were doing in the summers while you were water skiing. And both John and Anthony both stared at us like, A, they didn't know what Caldor was, so they didn't know not to be impressed. And B, they were like, that sounds like fun. They were so cool with it.
Right. No. I mean, you wrote about them very eloquently in terms of their personalities, but I love the scene that you set where you're walking out of the Caldor on a hot summer night, and you can feel the whole change in the weather and the heat of the asphalt as you're trying to find your car. All of us that grew up like you did remember those things fondly. I used to work at the Key Food, stocking shelves. So let's go to your career as a journalist at ABC for a second. Okay. You were taken around the world by ABC, the Far East, into different war zones. You write about these war zones with the great tension that war zones have in them. Obviously, you were in Afghanistan and Cambodia. Take us through that. But I want to talk about Annette Kreiner, because you describe Annette Kreiner as a make it or break it sort of. She seemed like a casting director in some ways. She was either going to make or break your career, depending on what side of her you happen to be on. So talk about her and talk about how you ended up in these war zones.
Well, I first sent my resume, which had basically I was a waitress and worked at middle management at Caldor, to 2020 when I was in college, and surprisingly, no one ever called me back. Then they used to have these job fairs for students who wanted to get into the media. So I would go to a lot of these job fairs, and one of them, this older guy who was in advertising at ABC, took my resume and said, "Oh, I know, I'll help you out. I'm going to give it to Annette Kreiner." And of course, I had heard of that name because I had sent my resume to her already. I said, "Oh, I already sent my resume to her." And he's like, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." And 3 days later, Annette Kreiner's office called, and a week after that, I was in her office having an interview, which I thought was for a part-time, a job, entry-level job. At the end of the interview, she hired me, and as an intern. And I was like, I thought I had won the lottery. Like, you mean I get to work here every day, 8 hours, 10 hours a day, and I don't get paid? I don't care. I was just so excited to be there. And I'll never forget, because I dressed up really nice, and I mimicked my outfit off of a actress called Holly Hunter.
Yeah, from Broadcast News, right?
Yeah, she was a producer in this movie, Broadcast News, and I wore exactly what she wore in one of her scenes. And I'll never forget Annette Kreiner, because she was known as, I didn't know this, as the Dragon Lady, like someone who could really make or break you. I get up and I'm so excited. I'm going to be an intern at ABC News 2020. And she said, I wore a pin and a peplum little jacket and a skirt. And she's like, oh, and by the way, we don't dress up that much around here. And that was my first piece of advice from Annette Kreiner. But anyway, I didn't care. Then I eventually morphed into the uniform of journalists, like, khaki pants and button-down shirts. And, I loved it. I stayed for the 3-month internship, and then I just never left. No one was asking me to leave. So I was like, wow, I guess I could just stay. I was filling in for desk assistants and production secretaries and logging videotape. I was doing everything for free still. So finally, I think they felt bad for me. They started paying me. And that first year I made $11,500. It was 1988. It couldn't have been, it was heaven. I just really thought I had gotten the golden ticket. And in a lot of ways I did. It was great. And then my first big assignment, honestly, and listen, I had never really traveled. We didn't have money. We didn't travel when we were kids. I never traveled much outside of, the tri-state area. And my boss called me in, and he's like, Peter, at that point, like a year or two later, I was working for Peter Jennings. He's like, Peter is really interested in Cambodia. He wants, we're going to go do a documentary in Cambodia. Are you interested in Cambodia? And of course, I could honestly barely place it on a map. I remember watching the movie, The Killing Fields. I'm like, oh, it's over there somewhere. I was like, oh my God, Cambodia. I'm so interested. I literally knew nothing. And I spent the next 3 months, like a kid who didn't go to Harvard or didn't go to fancy school, just researching and reading about Cambodia, 10, 12 hours a day for 3 months. By the time I got to Cambodia, I knew everything there was to know about it. And then we ended up doing a documentary that won a bunch of awards, and it was very well regarded. And that was sort of my first step into network news. And then after that, I was in Afghanistan, but before that, even you're probably too young, but I was in the Gulf War. 1992, I went to Israel during the Gulf War when Saddam Hussein was firing Scud missiles at Israel, and they thought at the time that they were chemical warheads. So we were suited up in hazmat gear. Of course, none of the journalists ever wore the hazmat because it got in the way of our work. And I spent about a month in Israel during that first Gulf War, and then later on, I did go to Afghanistan for about 6 weeks. I was in Kandahar with the 101st Airborne Division. It was quite an education there.
We also reported from Haiti, India.
Yeah. Bali. Yeah. So the piece in India was about Bollywood. So that wasn't quite hard hitting foreign news, but hey, it was India.
So listen, you have a fascinating life story, and you write about it glowingly. I mean, you're a phenomenal writer. You're weaving your love story with your husband in the book, also talking about your rite of passage from growing up. And I'm going to say this to you, and I think you're going to get this because I feel we grew up very similarly. There's a little bit of sheltering that takes place in a blue collar family in a blue collar neighborhood. You're with your family unit, you're with your friends, you have this little circuit of people that you hang out with, but you're not visiting country clubs. You're not visiting places of corporate acclamation, if you will. And so now you have to have this massive rite of passage. There's a chasm between a blue collar upbringing and a corporate office like West 67th Street at ABC or 85 Broad Street, where I ended up at Goldman Sachs when I got out of college.
Yeah.
And so you write about that beautifully. But let's talk about the Menendez brothers and this handsome young journalist stud by the name of Anthony Radziwill that you meet when you're covering this story in Los Angeles.
Yep. It was just, I was working for Peter Jennings at the time. He was working for Diane Sawyer, a show. It's not on the air anymore, called Primetime Live. And these two young boys had just, actually, they might have been charged or they were going to be charged, but the parents were murdered and they were suspects, very wealthy kids in Beverly Hills. And ABC flew out, I would say 15, this was when they had a lot of money before Disney took over, 15 people put us all up at the Four Seasons Hotel. And it was the first time I had ever been to Los Angeles, and certainly at Four Seasons. And we worked this story, and we did the first, I think it was a 2-hour, I could be wrong, maybe it was an hour, but I think it was a 2-hour special on the Menendez murder case. There was no trial yet. It was just the investigation. And Anthony was he was I was a PA, I was like lower, and he was an AP, and he was out there. And actually, honestly, as I think I write in the book, it wasn't like we met and it was like love at first sight. We just sort of became friends. And then, I went back to New York. He went back to New York. I then spent a month in Louisiana doing a documentary on abortion. And so we didn't, it was like starts and stops for at least like 6 or 8 months until we kind of were like, hey, you want to go get dinner? And it took a romantic turn, as they say.
You said that you didn't really fight. You sort of like gave each other the silent treatment a little bit, right? Or it was like a little bit of like a slow burning hostility, right? Didn't he went away on some trip, I think, while you were in the courtship period. And,
oh my God, Anthony.
And
that's so funny.
What's so funny about that?
Because you remember these little details. I haven't thought about this story. I haven't really thought about, these details. Yes, he did. I don't know. Dating was different back then. Obviously it's the 90s.
You went to the governor's ball with Buddy Roemer. He was out there hanging out as well, but you were crushing on him.
Buddy had a bit of a crush on me. I
think it was more than a crush, by the way. It seemed like he was making a move. He was going through a divorce, and he was making a move. And if you talked to Bill Clinton a little longer at the governor's ball, he probably was going to be making a move as well.
Oh, yeah. He was there too. But Buddy Roemer had warned me. He's like, be careful of the governor of Arkansas. No one knew but Bill Clinton at the time. He had not yet.
There's a rumor in the ABC gossip channel from mutual friends, that Buddy would write you poetry from time to time.
Oh my God. I have I tell you, Anthony, like 60 letters from Buddy Roemer, some poetry, but some like talking about politics and war and love. And like he had just gotten divorced, and I was so young. I didn't even and he seemed much older than me. He was like, I was 24, 25. He was like 40. Like that was like, wow, he's so grown up. And plus he's the governor, right? And I didn't get it right away. And also I was very, very conscious about my job as a journalist, and I would never get involved with anyone that I was reporting on, obviously. But then after the documentary aired, he took me to the White House, to the governor's ball at the White House. And, so I guess that would be like a date, but we end up being good friends. I invited him he came to my wedding.
Yes, I remember that as well. I also remember that you had the highest skirted dress at the governor's ball. Sure. Okay, so I just want to make sure I read the book. It's not like I'm just asking you questions. Okay, I like reading these books.
I was so young. I thought, I don't know, like all the governor's wives were much older, obviously, and they were like in ball gowns. I came in like a mini. I thought I looked so cute and so proper. It was like off the shoulder, little black Nicole Miller dress. I was like, plus I had no money. I had no money for a gown.
You are a great observer of human nature and the way humans interact with each other. You write about your friends and you crushing on Robert Redford. One of your friends throwing $10 into the cab for Robert Redford, and you write about this. And then you're watching the American Prince, John F. Kennedy Jr. He's now dealing with the Redford situation where people are gaggling about him. And so you're on the outside of the bubble. Now you're on the inside of the bubble, observing it from a different vantage point where the paparazzis are pointing cameras towards you and some of your family members. Tell us a little bit about that.
I remember when I first started dating Anthony, and of course I knew who his family was. I didn't, but it was like he had an office like down the hall from me, right? So it was like we met on a level playing field. It wasn't like I was meeting a Polish prince and his, kind of royal American prince cousins and family and his mom. Like it was I felt maybe this was like, the hubris of youth a little bit, but I was like, I'm an associate producer working for Peter and he works for Diane. I never, and Anthony, by the way, also John, never made me feel like I was an outsider at all. So it was just like, by the time I got around to meeting Anthony's family, Anthony and I had been dating for a good 6 or 8 or months or maybe longer. And I met his mom, and it was just like, I was nervous because I was meeting my new boyfriend's mom. I just never felt it was like they were up here and I was down there, and they never made me feel that way. So it just sort of happened. I didn't, and honestly, it was different times. So, John was, Anthony was not like, we weren't, paparazzi were not following us around. They were at our wedding and stuff like that. But like we could float through the city and be totally fine. John always had a little bit more of a problem, more so after he got married, and he was then with Carolyn, who was, 6'2" blonde. She was gorgeous, and the paparazzi loved, want to take her picture, 24/7. But we were able to fly under the radar, which was so nice. I went out a couple of times with John before he married, and when people didn't know that he was living with then Carolyn, who was one of my closest friend. I went out to some events with him occasionally because she just didn't want to deal with the paparazzi and the gossip. And it's hard. I mean, it just sounds a little spoiled and like rich kid problems, but it's very destabilizing to experience that. And yes, when I was a kid, of course, I saw Robert Redford on the street and I started screaming and yelling like a lunatic and following him and chasing him, much in the way that I saw later on people do with John. So it's interesting.
When did you know that your husband / fiance had a battle with cancer? Was that at the beginning part of dating him? It was after you fell in love with him? When did you realize that he was a testicular cancer survivor?
Yeah. He told me he had that years before, when he was much younger, like in his early 20s. When I met him, he was in his late 20s. He told me I kind of think it was pretty early on, like in the first few months, because he was thoughtful, and he thought he didn't want to get involved with someone, or he didn't want me to get involved with someone who couldn't have kids. It was like a conversation about children. And because he had previously had testicular cancer, and the treatments weren't like they are now, and probably men could have the treatments and still be fertile, he couldn't have kids. And I remember having that conversation, and we were young, and I was like, I wasn't dreaming about. I was never someone who really dreamed about having kids. I mean, if I had kids, it would be nice, but it didn't happen, and that was okay. And it wasn't a deal breaker with Anthony. I was like, okay, I didn't even think that
you fell in love with him. So, I mean, whether, you could have been in love with somebody that didn't have testicular cancer and turned out he was sterile as well. You're not going to fall out of love with somebody. My wife is a cancer survivor. She's a bladder cancer survivor. Very weird situation. She had it at a very young age. Thank God she's testing well, but it doesn't deter people from loving each other, that there's illnesses. You write, though, about this in a way that is incredibly compelling. There's no wonder that this is a best-selling book, because you describe life the way it happens. You're talking about tragedy just slips up upon you. It's not like it's announced. There's not like a PA system that says your life is about to abruptly change. You just have this slip up. You also write about the goddess, the matronly goddess Fortuna.
Yeah.
Tell us about the matronly Roman goddess Fortuna. And then I'm going to explain to you why all Italians are pagans, by the way. But let's talk a little bit about the matronly goddess Fortuna.
I guess even as a young kid, I was always sort of weirdly fascinated by these moments between fate and fortune and life and death. There's all through this, when I was writing that book, I went back, and the things that I remembered as a child were when my grandmother died, and this moment between, watching my younger sister find out the news. My younger sister and my grandmother were so close. She was 10 years old at the time. and that moment of like knowing, not knowing, then knowing. And then also in 7th grade, there was a horrible, tragic accident, and one of our classmates was killed in the school. And, these are the things that stick out in my mind, like this idea of fate, and like it could just happen. It's just like that. What you think is the road you think is in front of you is no longer there. And I guess I was a weird kid that really focused on that a lot. And I guess in a way, it prepared me for this life that I had later on with my husband, and certainly with John and Carolyn and the plane crash. And so I started thinking a lot about fate and fortune and what people think of regard as fortune. Like people would say to me, wow, Carol's so fortunate. She's so lucky. She's married this great guy into this, interesting family. But, fortune can be good and fortune can be bad. What they didn't know was that he had just been diagnosed with cancer. So, the goddess Fortuna, I kind of used her as sort of like this, this analogy of how people think one thing is going to happen and then another thing happens. I was a weird kid. I was a weird kid.
Well, you're a great writer, though. I mean, you talk about it with such clarity and such dispassion, and you also talk about the pain. And so the Greek word pathos is in the book, because obviously we all have an equal demise, right? Or as Mel Brooks says, relax, none of us are getting out of here alive.
Right.
But you're facing this as a young age. You're expecting your husband to die. But then what happens 3 weeks prior to your husband's death?
I know. It was the yeah. That's what I'm saying. Like we were all, Carolyn, John, and I, we were all living together at the Vineyard that summer. John and Carolyn going back and forth a little bit. John every weekend, Carolyn not every weekend, but certainly this weekend she was back and forth. We were prepared. It was, Anthony had cancer for 5 years, and it was the end. I knew it. Anthony was still in denial about it. John was coming around to the idea that his really closest friend, brother, relative, person, childhood buddy was going to die, and it was really, really affecting him. But we were all sort of preparing. John was writing the eulogy, actually, and Carolyn was always by my side. We were trying to keep Anthony up and happy, and that's where we were, all just holding our breath, waiting for, what was ultimately going to happen with Anthony. And then in literally 3 minutes, the 3 minutes it took for that plane to be flying to hit the Atlantic Ocean, and changed so many lives. And then Anthony, 3 weeks later, a little less than 3 weeks later, he passed away. I think, he was at the end stage of his cancer, but I think the plane crash, and I don't even think he had time to really process it. And that's what I mean about the goddess Fortuna. It's like, oh, you think this is going to happen? Well, this is going to happen first. It's a hard lesson. And that was a very dark summer. Very dark
sorry.
summer.
Tell us about the plans for July 18th. What were you going to do?
July 18th was it's the weekend before it was really super fun, because 𝗕cie 𝗵𝗺𝗺 is a close friend, still is, close family friend, very close, was in college with John, and her and her new husband, Jamie Rubin, who was Assistant Secretary of State, were up for the weekend, and we just had the best weekend. It was, I don't know, Anthony was kind of like able to, get around. We were at the beach, and it was really fun. And actually Carolyn was going to stay that week, but at the last minute she decided to go back to the city. Fate, I don't know. And then the following weekend, they were coming up, as they always did on the weekend. And, it was hard to be alone with Anthony during the week. I was scared a lot. Martha's Vineyard doesn't even have a hospital on it. I was nervous a lot when I was alone with him during the week. So I was just really so grateful that they were coming back, and that I think Carolyn was going to stay for a week or two after that, like, because she knew that I was really it was hard for me to stay alone with Anthony at this point. So we were just waiting, living our little lives, thinking everything was going to be put on hold until Anthony passed away, and we got our lives together and figured, they were really my support at that time. Like, when you have cancer, you might know this because your wife, your world gets small. Anthony didn't want a lot of people knowing, so there weren't a lot of people I confided in, and just a handful of people. Even in fact, a lot of people didn't even know he was ill till the very end. And it was
listen, I'm sorry about all of it, and I'm bringing it up because it's so poignant in the book and it's so real worldly. And there's the reason why I wanted to have you on. I want to encourage people to read the book because as tragic as the story is, it's also very comforting because you're talking about life the way life is, not the way we want it to be or the way we think it should be, but it's really just frankly the way life is. And there's a sweetness to the way you're talking about it, which I found for me, it was incredibly eye-opening, and there's a warmth about you that's in this book. And I'm going to switch topics abruptly because there's another part of your life where you are a real housewife of New York. Okay, well, there are some characters there, I would say, and that's for sure. I mean, did your Italian side come out in full force?
You know what? You would think it would. That was so. It was so counterintuitive to who I was as a person. I mean, I had spent 15 years nearly at ABC News, and then 5 or 7 years at that point writing quietly alone. What Remains, and then my second book, a novel, Widow's Guide to Sex and Dating. I had a pretty quiet life, and I decided to do that show kind of like on a whim. It wasn't even like I thought. I had never seen it, to be honest, so I didn't really know what I was getting into. But I just thought, I'm just finished my second book. It's hard to sell books, especially hard to sell novels. And this show apparently is super popular, and I could sell some books. And in fact, it put What Remains back on the bestseller list. But no, I didn't. I just thought the women were, the first couple of seasons, I was just like, I used to say, I think I'm on a comedy and they think they're in a drama. I just found their antics and their personality and the things they said and what they did. I'd never seen women like that. I was super sheltered, I guess. And, growing up at ABC News in a newsroom, it was like a boys club, right? So it wasn't like I wasn't used to competition and stuff, but like I had never been around women that acted the way that these women acted. And so I thought that it was, in the beginning, it was really fun. And I just thought they were nuts, like nuts. But
it's tough though, right?
Funny,
it's tough to do reality television. I mean, listen, I've done 2 shows.
I know. I
haven't been on the show as long as you, but I mean, I'm jumping out of helicopters. I set my ass on fire, running out of a house in special forces. I mean, and they're unscripted, but obviously the parts of it are scripted because you're sitting in certain situations that the production staff puts you in.
Yeah.
And then you're trying to get along with strangers, right? I mean, you're sitting there. I was sleeping on a cot in the middle of the Jordanian desert with 16 strangers with no indoor plumbing. We had no plumbing. We were actually, using a cistern to go to the bathroom. And so, it was pretty stressful. You've had some interesting lunches. Okay, let's talk about some of these lunches, okay? Because you wrote a lunch date series for Glamour. Okay, lunches included Rudolph Giuliani, Prince Andrew, Alec Baldwin. I mean, could you have been more ahead of the stories? I mean, let's go over these things. Okay, so.
Glamour asked me to do that column right after my memoir was published. And that was the best gig I ever had. It was like very little work. My whole job was to take movie stars and famous people to lunch and talk to them about whatever thing that they were promoting. And the conceit of it was kind of flirty, fun. And I did women too. And I remember I got paid a nice amount of money for that. That was a great gig. It only lasted like 2 years because after a while, it's like the same questions to celebrities, like the same thing over and over again. It's not that interesting. But yeah, I had some pretty like amazing guests who would then go on to do some really insane things, as you pointed out. Prince Andrew, Alec Baldwin recently, right? And
Did
who
you
was the
think
other?
that
Oh, Rudy Giuliani. Rudy Giuliani was what a shame. What a shame. I mean, talk about fall from grace. He was America's mayor when I did that interview. I mean, he was like, everyone loved that dude. But that's what happens.
Do you think that as we are faced with our mortality, some of us go insane?
I think, I think it happens to men more than women. I think, I think there's like a grasping, like a desperation, and it comes out in all sorts of different ways.
It's almost a need to be relevant, right? You are
Yeah.
at the top of the food chain one day, and you're a has-been the next day.
Yeah.
And maybe
But
if you don't grow up in a blue-collar Italian family, you're taking yourself a little bit too seriously, maybe, right?
I mean, what you do mention, like the blue collar, it's such a great, listen, I look back at the way
it's simple, Carol. It's simple. Our families were simple. You know what I mean? So you got the simplicity of life and all that entailed. You didn't have to be the do-all, be everything, right?
No, exactly. And like, especially going on that reality show, and it's a super relevant conversation in pop culture, right? I wasn't like, wow, people recognize me on the street, or I'm relevant, or, I'm famous. I didn't care about any of that. And it has direct result. It was a direct connection to how I was brought up. Like I'm still that girl from upstate New York,
Mm-hmm.
and then when I was off the show, if I said anything in the press, there's always like haters on social media saying, "Oh, you're trying to be relevant. You're irrelevant." Like, it's like, no, I'm relevant in my life with the people I love, with my family, with my friends. I don't need to be relevant above that. There's no need
But some people do. We both know that. Some people do.
Like Rudy Giuliani.
You're like Rudy would be example of that. But did you have lunch with Trump? I mean, you hated Trump, right? In 2016, you went door to door for Secretary Clinton, and you called Trump a buffoon. I
called him that on national TV. And by the way,
I wish I had met you back then. You would have probably convinced me not to go work for him. So anyway, that's just my misjudgment. But you must have hated his guts, no?
You know what? I was on the show, was season 8 or 9, and and we film in October, right? So the election is at the beginning of November. We start filming in October, but that whole summer, I'm following the primary. Then he caught my attention early on in the primary, and I thought, this guy, there's just no way he's going to go. He's going to make it. Then he made it. Then he got the nomination. Then I was watching the convention, so I was really, really shocked. And by the time I started filming the show, I was like, I don't think people there was something, just a visceral bad reaction I had when I watched him, saw him in his, like, you could tell instantly that he was a sociopath and narcissist, like instantly. And so I was like, this is bad. And I remember sitting, trying to talk to the other housewives, none of whom even knew there was an election going on, I think, about how bad this guy was going to be. That, like, they didn't understand how bad this guy was going to be for our country. And I don't know. Not that I knew before. Everyone kind of, well, maybe you didn't, Anthony, but like a lot of people were like,
well,
oh no.
I thought he was the better of two, people because of my Republican Party politics. So that was my mistake. And, listen, we did a lot of cognitive dissonance with Trump, meaning we were overlooking a lot of things, at least, when it became impossible, I spoke out against him. And when he was sitting president, and I went on a national campaign to try to stop him from becoming president again. But, I should have met you earlier. You would have set me straight. Maybe you would have hit me with a wooden spoon like your grandmother or something.
I just feel like I cried. I cried on camera. I was really like, and it's not like I cried because Hillary lost. I would have preferred her as president, obviously. I just thought, this guy, I didn't know why at the time. I just like, this is really going to be bad and I think that truth was borne out. I think, I mean, You should have hung in there past 11 days. I mean, maybe you.
Well, no, they fired me. I got fired. I went after Steve Bannon, and and they fired me, which is fine. I think I've been vindicated by what's going on with Steve Bannon. Okay, we're coming up to the part of the show where I'm going to read you 5 subjects, and then I want you to give me your sort of instantaneous blink response to these subjects. Ready?
Okay.
Okay, ready? Millie DeFalco.
Oh my fat Italian grandmother, full of love.
With the big boobs. She had big boobies. You wrote about them in the book.
Yeah, she used to. She would steal. She'd go to the grocery store and she would put food items, expensive food items like lamb chops and stuff, in the basket where you would put like a kid, or your purse, and she put her boobs over it and just walk right out the door. No one even stopped her. She was a character. She was the first she was a housewife, basically. She was a housewife. So she was the first character. I never, I grew up around that. So I was like, maybe I was kind of like used to these over the top, colorful Italian, She grew marijuana in her vegetable
listen, you wrote about her beautifully, and it's and you know what? She lives inside of you today, Carole. Okay, all of that earthiness and all of that authenticity. So, Peter Jennings.
Wow, Peter Jennings. Now, I always say I was so lucky to learn from the best. Like I really, I even say to people now. Working for Peter really set me up for success, because he was I remember saying when I was a kid, a nobody from nowhere upstate, I was like, I'm going to work for ABC News, because that was the #1 network, and Peter Jennings was #1, and I only wanted to work for #1. And, people around me in my town would be like, oh, who do you think you are? You're not going to work for him. And then when I did, I really learned from the best. Honestly, to this day, I look at the anchors. There's no one better than him. You would show up, of course I was an overachiever a little bit, and maybe a little insecure about not having gone to Harvard and Ivy. You'd go into a meeting with him, and there was no room for error. We had memos at the time, memos typed out, bullet points, neat. We all used the same font even. And if Peter asked you a question, if you didn't know the answer, the only thing you had to say is, I'm not sure, I'll get back to you. And then you got back to him. He just, it was like my sentimental education. It was like where I learned how to be a reporter, how to also to conduct yourself. There was just an elegance about him. That was the best 8 years. It was the first 8 years that I worked for ABC. I worked directly for him in this very elite documentary unit. It was just like 6 of us, and I worked for the best, and it was just such a great.
I remember the last day of 1999, where I think he was on the air almost for the entire day. You remember that, when on the turning of the millennium? Let's go to Anthony Radziwill.
Oh, well, Anthony was like, I used to say, if he wasn't a reporter, he would have been a pilot, because there was something so fierce and so straight. And like, he just made you feel, when you were in his presence, instantly like everything was going to be okay. He was just, and he had such a great sense of humor. He was so down to earth. He had lived this crazy life growing up. I mean, yet privilege and travel and the best of the best, and been exposed to so many great artists and business people. But there was such a earthiness to him. Like he loved the DeFalco clan. They used to say the Kennedy clan. He'd be like, oh, it's all about the DeFalco clan. He was just I don't know, he was so privileged, and he never used it, he just never used it. He was always very, and I think, and John the same way. The two of them were very similar in that way. John would always introduce himself to people, even though everyone in the world knew he was. It was just like, it's very well mannered.
You said he always left out the F. He just said, I'm John Kennedy, right?
Yeah, he would never say.
And he always tried to make people feel comfortable in his presence and get the elephant out of the room quickly.
Yeah.
Quick to tell a joke to diffuse a situation, right?
Yeah. I mean, they both had enormous amounts of charm, and they used it, and they knew how to deploy it and when to deploy it. But Anthony grew up. I mean, he was all safety net. I grew up with no safety nets. Anthony was so. It was just like a great, and he just loved how crazy the 𝗕𝗵𝗁𝗺𝗺s were. Like I was like, oh God, this and like, and he just loved it. Half my cousins showed up in like sequins for our wedding, which was on the beach. Yeah, it was crazy. Like it was classic Italian crazy.
All right. So speaking of a beach wedding, let's talk about 𝗕liche Radziwill.
Yeah. She was another character. I miss her. There's no one. 𝗕liche was a very singular person. I was just talking about her the other day to someone. There's no one really like her. As a mother-in-law, Anthony was her prince. And, I don't know, mother-in-laws always have that reputation of being really different. She was great. I mean, I was always like a little nervous, like I wasn't like measuring up maybe, but she never ever said anything or maybe kind of, think that that's what she was thinking. It got complicated when Anthony got sick, and it was really hard for her to see that and to deal with it. But I will tell you, like, I knew her for 20 something years, and sometimes we'd be really close. And after Anthony died, we were really close. And then we kind of broke, we kind of separated and grew apart a little. But at the end of her life, I'd say the last 5 years, I would go over to her apartment and it would just be the two of us having dinner alone. And it was so great to connect with her. And I felt like at the end of her life, she really finally like got who I was and I got who she was. Like we just really got each other. And it was really sad the day I heard that she had died. I knew she was very sick though. And, but she was great. It was hard to be Jackie Kennedy's sister because it's hard to live in that shadow. But I tell you, she was the beautiful one, the stylish one, the very, very well-read, always knew what was going on politically. And the one thing I learned from her, she wasn't sentimental. She didn't like wax poetically, sentimentally about this previous life she had in this glamorous 60s and 70s. She was really, I think at the end, it really saves you. She wasn't like longing to be back in that life. She really appreciated, whatever experience she was having at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
I learned that's a good lesson from her.
What about Carolyn Bessette Kennedy?
Yeah. Well, there was no one like her. And honestly, maybe everyone says that, but she was really an original. I remember the moment I met her. John and I and Anthony and I shared a beach house, and he came with this beautiful girl one weekend, Memorial Day weekend, and we just hit it off instantly. I didn't know that she had grown up in blue collar, not far from where I grew up, or I didn't know anything about her because she was so beautiful and sophisticated, and she was in fashion, and but at the end of the day, we had similar stories. We both moved to the big city to make it, right? She made it in fashion. I made it in journalism. And there was immediate connection. And I just thought she was great. Sadly, though, like 2 weekends later, they had broken up because John had gotten back with an old girlfriend, Daryl Hannah. And so for the rest of the summer, it was Daryl Hannah. And when
Daryl Hannah and her cats,
and the cats, yeah. I was like, damn. But John and I would always ask John about Carolyn. I knew that they were always in touch, and so I was the least surprised when after his mother passed away, it was shortly after that they got back together, and that that was it for him. I mean, he was really besotted with her. She was someone that anyone could fall in love with. She was just. She was authentic. She was real. She was authentic. She was down to earth. She was whip smart, really funny. Sometimes I think that she's having a resurgence on social media. There's all these young girls that obviously didn't know her or weren't alive when she was alive. But there's so many Instagram feeds and social media
she
pictures.
Had style. She had a style about her. I remember when they were married. Obviously, they were in the press a lot, and
yeah.
She had style. I had not met either of them. I think I think I saw John F. Kennedy Jr. speak at a charity conference
Mhm.
or at a charity dinner once. But I'd never met either of them. I read somewhere that you said you only have 15 good summers left. What the hell are you
No,
talking
no,
about?
no.
Okay, what the hell are you
Okay.
talking about? I mean,
It wasn't
you and I.
15.
And by the way,
It
you were very flattering. You and I are the same age, just so you know.
are?
Okay,
Oh my
and
God, so you were
I
so
think you're born on the 20. Are you a Leo or a Virgo? How would
I'm a
you
Leo.
describe? You're a
Leo.
Leo. Yeah, you come across as a Leo. You have the
I have a lot of
hairline of a Leo. What's that?
I have a lot of Virgo, and my moon is Virgo, and I'm really
Yeah.
into astrology. So I just got my birth chart read. So I'm
Yeah.
having a really good year. This year is a year of no opposition. I have no bad transits. I am like my stars are in my 9th house, which is the house of publishing and production. So which is a good thing because I'm adapting What Remains into a one-woman play. So I'm hoping that has some success.
Oh, good for
But
you. How's
yeah,
that coming?
yeah.
When will that come out?
Well, I don't know. I've never obviously written a play, but a production company in London had suggested I do that. So it's been really interesting. So I'm actually revisiting What Remains right now, but not, I'm only writing the very beginning parts of it. Yeah. And I just saw A Dollhouse with 𝗕ciecie𝗸 last night.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to every play I can think of, I'm just going to plays, good ones, bad ones, big ones, little ones. So astrology, like that I'm big into astrology. Anyway, I got off the point. What was your question? Because I feel like I got off the point.
I get the question, but I'm saying, a good Leo, you've got more than 15 good summers.
Okay,
left.
no,
I
okay,
mean,
you're
come
right.
on.
Thank you for reminding me. I wasn't 15. I said 5 good summers, and it was
Okay.
related to, but I was wrong. It's actually been 15. It was 15. So you were right. It related to the reality show which I was on, and my second season, I met and started dating and had a long, serious relationship with a man who was 22 years younger than me. So I would joke like, hey, listen, dude, I only have like 5 good summers left. I don't want to use them all up with you. And it just, on that reality show, you never know what you're going to say that sticks. So everyone will say on social media and comment, they're like, what summer is this? Or, wow, you had way more than 5 summers left. Now it's been 8 or 9 summers. So I was wrong, and I admitted I was wrong. I definitely probably have 15 good summers left. I don't know what it meant. Again, on that show, I was always joking. I was always saying the dumbest things. Like I was never really serious about anything I said, except relating to Donald Trump. And people, they just latch onto something, and then it just all of a sudden it's like you're known for that. Who knows? I said a lot of dumb shit on that show, Anthony.
Hey, let me tell you something. I've said a lot of dumb stuff too. It's all good. Okay. It's just about being real.
Yeah.
You've written an amazing book. I enjoy your personality a great deal. You're incredibly down to earth and authentic. The title of the best-selling book, the runaway bestseller, is What Remains, a memoir of fate, friendship, and love. Carole, thank you for joining me on Open Book today.
Thank you for having me. It was really a pleasure. So nice to talk to you, Anthony. And I'm happy we're both Italian. So
yeah, you see that? It's interesting. You identify, even though you have Austrian in you, you identify with the 𝗕cie on the Italian side, right? You can't help yourself, right?
yeah.
Yeah, of course.